Jason boarded the Midnight Express. The station was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of the city and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The train, with its dimly lit interior, stood like a beacon in the night, promising a journey of solitude and reflection. He always took this train. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after the long hours spent at the library. The familiar creak of the train's doors and the soft hum of the engine were like a lullaby, soothing his weary mind. It was comfortably familiar, a steel and glass cocoon ferrying him home after his late shift at the library. The seats, though worn, provided a sense of comfort, and the dim lighting created an atmosphere of calm and introspection. The train car was mostly empty tonight. The usual crowd of late-night travelers was absent, leaving behind an almost ghostly silence that enveloped the car. A few figures were hunched in their seats, shrouded by the dim lights. Their faces were obscured, lost in their own worlds, much like Jason was about to be. Jason chose his usual spot, a forward-facing seat near the back, and pulled out his book. This was his ritual, a moment of peace before the train carried him back to the hustle and bustle of daily life. The train lurched forward, its familiar rhythm comforting. The gentle sway of the car and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks were like a metronome, setting the pace for his thoughts to wander. Jason quickly became engrossed in the pages of his book, the outside world fading away. The stories he read transported him to different realms, far from the mundane reality of his everyday life. He loved this time on the train. It was his escape, a brief respite from the demands of the world, where he could lose himself in the adventures and lives of fictional characters. It was a time to decompress, a time to escape into fictional worlds. As the train sped through the night, Jason felt a sense of tranquility wash over him, knowing that for these few precious moments, he was free. The conductor made his rounds, a familiar face in the dim light. He nodded at Jason, who returned the gesture with a slight smile. This silent exchange was part of the routine, a small but comforting interaction. Jason glanced out the window, watching the dark landscape blur past. The city lights gradually gave way to the quiet suburbs, and then to the open fields where the only illumination came from the moon and stars. He adjusted his seat, settling in more comfortably. The train's gentle rocking was almost hypnotic, lulling him into a state of deep relaxation. Occasionally, Jason would exchange a few words with a fellow passenger. These brief conversations were always polite, often about the weather or the lateness of the hour, but they added a human touch to his solitary journey. After these interactions, he would return to his book, a smile playing on his lips. The stories within its pages were his true companions, offering endless adventures and insights. As the train moved through a tunnel, the lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Jason barely noticed, too engrossed in his reading to be disturbed by the fleeting darkness. Eventually, Jason closed his book, feeling content. The train was nearing his stop, and he felt a sense of gratitude for these quiet moments of escape and reflection. As the train pulled into the station, Jason gathered his belongings, ready to step back into the real world. The Midnight Express had once again provided him with a sanctuary, a brief but cherished respite from the demands of everyday life. A sudden chill ran down Jason's spine, pulling him out of the book. He looked up, a shiver running through him. The train car felt strangely cold. He noticed the air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural silence. The usual hum of the train seemed muffled, distant. Even the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks had taken on a strange, almost hesitant quality. Jason glanced at the other passengers. They remained unmoving, their faces obscured by the shadows. He couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had gripped him. It was as if the air had become thick with something unseen, something sinister. The lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Out of the corner of his eye, Jason thought he saw a shadowy figure move. His heart raced as he turned to look, but there was nothing there. Faint whispers began to fill the air, growing louder and more insistent. Jason covered his ears, trying to block out the unsettling sounds. The windows started to fog up, and he could see faint handprints appearing on the glass. He stared at the handprints, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. The atmosphere in the train car had turned sinister, as if the very air was alive with malevolence. Jason felt trapped, his unease growing with every passing second. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The train continued its journey into the unknown, carrying with it an air of impending doom. His gaze fell on the digital display above the door. The train had been moving smoothly, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks almost soothing. But now, something was off. The usual hum of conversation had died down, replaced by an eerie silence. The scrolling message that usually displayed the next stop was gone. Instead, the screen flickered, struggling to display anything coherent. Jason squinted, hoping to catch a glimpse of the familiar station names, but there was nothing. In its place, a single chilling phrase blinked on the screen: dead end. The words seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, each blink sending a shiver down his spine. Jason stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What did it mean? Was this some kind of sick joke? Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. His hand gripped the seat tightly, knuckles turning white. He glanced around, hoping to find someone who could explain, someone who shared his confusion. This had to be some kind of mistake, a malfunction. Maybe the system was just down, he thought, trying to calm himself. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. He tried to rationalize the situation, but the chill in the air, the heavy silence, and the unmoving figures of the other passengers all pointed to something deeply wrong. The train, once a bustling hub of activity, now felt like a tomb. He looked back at the passengers, his unease growing into full-blown terror as he noticed their eyes. They were all staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if in a trance. They were open, wide, and completely black. It was as if their souls had been sucked out, leaving behind empty shells. They seemed to stare right through him, their gazes cold and empty. Jason felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had to get out of there, but the train showed no signs of stopping. The words, dead end, continued to blink ominously, sealing his fate. Desperation took over. Jason lunged for the emergency stop button, pressing it repeatedly. But nothing happened. The train continued its relentless journey, ignoring his frantic attempts to halt it. He banged on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The other passengers remained motionless, their eerie stares fixed on the void. Jason pulled out his phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen taunted him with the words, "no service," adding to his growing sense of isolation and dread. He peered out the window, but all he could see was darkness. The train seemed to be traveling through an endless tunnel, with no sign of light or an exit. Exhausted and defeated, Jason collapsed into a seat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. The words, dead end, continued to blink, a grim reminder of his inescapable fate. The train's digital display was relentless, the phrase, dead end, flashing with a malevolent persistence. Jason's hope dwindled with each passing second, the reality of his situation sinking in. But then, a spark of determination ignited within him. He couldn't just sit there and accept his fate. He had to find a way out, to escape this nightmare. With renewed resolve, Jason stood up, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him. The next day, authorities combed through the abandoned train, their flashlights piercing through the oppressive darkness. Each step echoed through the empty carriages, a stark reminder of the eerie silence that had replaced the usual hustle and bustle. The investigators found no clues, no signs of a struggle, just the faint, rhythmic rasp of breathing that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the train. Detective Emily Hart stood at the entrance of the train, her eyes scanning the interior with a mix of curiosity and dread. She had heard the stories, the whispered legends of the train that never stopped, but she had always dismissed them as mere folklore. Now, standing in front of the ghostly relic, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the tale. Emily's flashlight flickered as she made her way through the carriages, her footsteps echoing through the empty space. She paused at the seat where Jason had been last seen, her fingers brushing against the cold fabric. A chill ran down her spine as she felt an inexplicable connection to the young man, as if his presence still lingered in the air. As Emily moved deeper into the train, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The rhythmic rasp of breathing grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with a sense of impending doom. She reached the control room, her heart pounding in her chest. The buttons and levers moved on their own, the shadowy figures from Jason's nightmare now visible to her. The figures whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their voices a chilling chorus that filled the room with dread. Emily's flashlight flickered again, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and she spun around, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there. The shadowy figures had vanished, leaving only the faint, rhythmic rasp of breathing behind. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed. She knew she had to find out what had happened to Jason, to uncover the truth behind the train's mysterious journey. Determined, Emily made her way back to the entrance of the train, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. She knew that the answers she sought lay somewhere within the ghostly relic, and she was determined to find them. The legend of the train that never stops had become her reality, and she was ready to face whatever horrors awaited her. As she stepped off the train, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The faint, rhythmic rasp of breathing followed her, a haunting reminder of the terror that had unfolded within the train's walls. She knew that her journey had just begun, and that the mystery of Jason's disappearance was far from over. The train continued its endless journey, a ghostly apparition that haunted the night. And as Emily stood on the platform, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find the answers she sought, or if she too would become another lost soul on the train that never stops. The train lurched forward, gaining speed at an alarming rate. It was as if the very tracks beneath it were propelling it into an abyss of darkness, a void from which there was no return. The night outside was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, casting an eerie gloom over the landscape. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was the only sound, a haunting melody that seemed to echo the fear in Jason's heart. Jason gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning white. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of terror. He had boarded this train expecting a simple journey, but now he was trapped in a nightmare. The other passengers, once lively and chatty, had fallen silent, their faces masks of fear and confusion. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of the surreal situation. The lights flickered overhead, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the faces of the other passengers. Each flicker seemed to bring the shadows to life, twisting and contorting them into monstrous shapes. The air was thick with tension, every creak and groan of the train amplifying the sense of impending doom. Jason's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he tried to steady himself. He looked around frantically for help, for an explanation, but the other passengers remained eerily still. Their eyes were wide with terror, their bodies rigid as if frozen in time. Jason's mind screamed for him to do something, anything, but his body refused to move. He was paralyzed by fear, trapped in his seat as the train hurtled through the night. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the other passengers were gone. The seats were empty. Jason was alone. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of the other passengers a stark reminder of his isolation. He called out, his voice echoing through the empty cabin, but there was no response. The train continued its relentless journey, oblivious to his plight, but he could still hear it, a soft, rhythmic rasp, breathing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the train, but it grew louder with each passing moment. The sound seemed to come from all around him, surrounding him, suffocating him. Jason's blood ran cold as he realized he was not alone. Something, or someone, was with him in the cabin. It seemed to be coming from all around him, surrounding him. His blood ran cold. The breathing was rhythmic, almost mechanical, as if it were the very heartbeat of the train. Jason's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. He tried to focus, to find a way out, but the oppressive darkness and the relentless sound of the breathing made it impossible to think clearly. The digital display flickered once more, the message changing to a final, terrifying statement. Last stop, nowhere. The words burned into Jason's mind, a grim reminder of his fate. He was trapped on a train with no destination, no escape. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and disoriented. The train was a prison, and he was its only inmate. A figure began to coalesce from the shadows at the far end of the car. It was tall and skeletal, its form shrouded in darkness. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its movements fluid and deliberate. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure approach, each step bringing it closer to him. He wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. It was tall and skeletal, its form shrouded in darkness. The figure seemed to absorb the light, its presence a void in the already dim cabin. Jason's mind screamed for him to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, a prisoner of his own fear. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness and fixing on Jason with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. Two glowing red eyes pierced through the gloom, fixing on Jason with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. The eyes were cold and unfeeling, devoid of any humanity. They seemed to bore into his very soul, exposing his deepest fears and insecurities. Jason's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but the eyes held him captive, their gaze unrelenting. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then, everything went black. The darkness was absolute, a void that swallowed him whole. Jason's mind spiraled into panic, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. He felt himself slipping away, his consciousness fading into the abyss. The last thing he heard was the rhythmic rasp of the breathing, a haunting reminder of the terror that had consumed him. The next morning, the train was found abandoned on a stretch of track miles from its usual route. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. The mystery of the train's journey and its missing passengers a topic of endless speculation. Authorities searched the train from top to bottom, but there was no sign of Jason or any of the other passengers. The train was empty, a ghostly relic of a nightmarish journey. The doors were locked, the windows were sealed, and there was no sign of Jason. It was as if the train had simply swallowed him whole, erasing any trace of his existence. The authorities were baffled, their investigation yielding no answers. The train was a mystery, a puzzle with no solution. The only clue was the faint, rhythmic rasp of the breathing, a haunting echo of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. But some say that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear the faint rhythmic sound of a train speeding through the darkness, its whistle a mournful cry echoing in the stillness. The legend of the train that never stops has become a ghost story, a tale whispered among those who dare to venture near the tracks at night. The train is a specter, a reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the darkness. And some say that if you look closely at the windows as it passes, you might just see the face of a young man, his eyes wide with terror, trapped forever on the train that never stops. Jason's fate is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lie in the unknown. The train continues its endless journey, a ghostly apparition that haunts the night, its passengers forever lost in the darkness. As the train sped through the night, Jason's consciousness flickered back. He found himself in the control room, surrounded by shadowy figures. The control panel was dimly lit, the buttons and levers moving on their own. The figures whispered in a language he couldn't understand, their voices a chilling chorus that filled the room with dread. Jason's heart raced as he realized he was not alone. The shadowy figures turned towards him, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Jason tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The figures surrounded him, their presence suffocating. Shadowy hands reached out towards him, their touch cold and clammy. Jason felt a chill run down his spine as the hands closed around him, pulling him into the darkness. He struggled to break free, but the grip was too strong. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with fear and confusion. Jason's face contorted in terror as the shadowy figures pulled him deeper into the darkness. He felt himself slipping away, his consciousness fading once more. The last thing he saw was the glowing eyes of the figures, their gaze piercing through the darkness, holding him captive. The train was found abandoned once again, this time on a different stretch of track. The authorities were baffled, their investigation yielding no answers. The train was empty, a ghostly relic of a nightmarish journey. The only clue was the faint, rhythmic rasp of the breathing, a haunting echo of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. And still, on quiet nights, the faint, rhythmic sound of the train speeding through the darkness can be heard, its whistle a mournful cry echoing in the stillness. The legend of the train that never stops has become a ghost story, a tale whispered among those who dare to venture near the tracks at night. The train is a specter, a reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the darkness. And some say that if you look closely at the windows as it passes, you might just see the face of a young man, his eyes wide with terror, trapped forever on the train that never stops. Jason's fate is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers that lie in the unknown. The train continues its endless journey, a ghostly apparition that haunts the night, its passengers forever lost in the darkness.